insistent that I think we needed to have a fundamental reform of the European Union, and it just wasn't forthcoming. And so that's why I changed my mind.
When you see a headline that says hypocrite, though? I
think it's quite an extraordinary headline, yeah, and I completely disagree with this. You know, like most people, I started life, I was brought up thinking that the EU was a good thing. I absolutely believed it. I spent a great deal of time in the last Parliament actually working on something called the Fresh Start project, which was really looking at trying to get serious reform of the EU, and put forward lots of proposals, travelled around Europe trying to persuade people. And of course we got nowhere. So in my opinion, when the facts change, you change your mind. It was very clear to me we have a fabulous future outside the EU, and it was at the point when the Prime Minister came back with his renegotiation that I thought, right, well, this is not the right thing for us. We absolutely need to make our way in the world, and we can. There is a great future that lies ahead of us.
Theresa May is so far ahead. Doesn't it make sense for you all to rally around her and call off this contest so you have a new Prime Minister?
I think people will want to see a choice. I've always said that. That's why I put my name forward, because I think people do want to see a choice of candidates, and that's what I'm trying to make sure they get.
And you compare yourself to Margaret Thatcher?
I don't know. People have asked me if I certainly admire a lot of things about her, but I would not compare myself with anyone. I'm just myself.
What chance do you think you have of winning?
I think it's really important for people in this country to have a choice of candidates, and I want to be one of those choices. I think I genuinely have spent a great deal of time learning about the European Union, the prospects for reform, doing a lot of detailed work, and I believe I can lead this country out of the EU into a really bright future ahead of us.
Do you think you've got the qualities to be a Prime Minister, do you?
Well, I certainly do, yes. I genuinely have had a very serious career, 25 years in finance, and I believe the time is right for somebody to lead this country who believes in the future for us outside of the EU, and I believe that's me.
You've changed your mind on Europe. What makes the electorate trust someone like you who has changed your views in the way that you have?
I think people do change their views. I think as you go through life, you start off, I was raised, as most of us were, at thinking that the EU was somehow inevitable. And I certainly came into Parliament thinking we need change, but that actually we should stay in the EU. I was always very clear, in fact, in that very lecture that was talked about today, I was very clear that the relationship with the EU is unsustainable, and that status quo in the EU is simply not an option.
You don't worry it undermines people's faith in
politics? No, not at all. No, I really don't think so. Everybody, every single one of you, if you were interested in voting to leave in the prospects for the UK outside of the EU, you will all have had a moment where you thought, actually, this isn't working for us. Now, for me, I studied this in great detail when I came into Parliament, did a huge amount of work, set up an all-party group and the Fresh Start project, wrote a lot of papers about this, always being very clear that the UK needed to have a fundamental reform if we were to make a success of our role in the EU. And what was very clear and what changed my mind is that renegotiation, that reform was simply not going to happen, and that therefore there was no chance for us with the direction that the EU was headed in. There was simply no chance for the UK within the EU. We're not part of the single currency, we're not part of the Schengen area. They have enormous problems that they need to resolve, and they're holding us back. The UK can negotiate free trade, we can do so much in the world outside the EU, and they are just holding us back.
If you became leader and Prime Minister, when would you trigger Article 50?
As soon as possible. And I'm not going to put a date on it because obviously it's subject to a number of issues, but the key thing would be to set out the red lines for renegotiation, to start talking about those straight away, and to trigger either Article 50 and or revoking the Communities Act just as soon as we can.